Well, thank you so much for that amazing introduction. It's really a great pleasure to be here tonight. I'm not going to stand behind the podium because it makes me look too short, but hopefully you can hear me. I just want to say it's really a pleasure to be back in Western Colorado. Some of you I spoke to today, I mentioned that my first real job in the summer of 1980 was here in Western Colorado, working out of Grand Junction, Salida, and Buena Vista. So this is a part of the world that's really close to my heart. And it's been kind of a long journey from starting as an exploration geologist, exploiting natural resources, to being in the position I am today. But I think everything everyone just said in the last few minutes resonates with me so deeply, because everything I've done, everything I've worked for, everything I care about, it's not about rejecting the resources that our planet offers us. It's not about freezing in the dark. It's about finding ways to live on this planet, to use resources wisely, and to share those resources equitably. So with that, I'd like to talk to you today about what do we do next. So I know there are a lot of people who are outdoor oriented, so I thought I'd start with this slide from a rock climbing trip I did a few years ago in California. And those of you who climb or hike or ski know that sometimes there are those moments where you just think, now what? And one of the things you know if you climb or you ski is that whatever the answer is, it's not turning back. In this particular climb, there was no going down. There was only continuing to go up. And so we're in a moment like that right now with respect to climate change. And the honest to God truth is that right now things are not really looking very good. The news that keeps coming out of the scientific community is deeply worrisome, and the politics we're facing, particularly on the federal level, are worrisome too. So what do we do? What do we do in the face of that very real challenge? Well, obviously, we have to accept the scientific evidence. We can't deny what's going on. So I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about the science, because we really do have to come to grips with how serious this problem is, because it's essential to understanding the temporal urgency. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, when scientists first began to bring this issue to public attention, it was possible to say, well, we have time to work this out. That's no longer possible to say. So how do we know that? Well, I think all of you in this audience know we have tremendous amounts of data now that show that recent temperature records have been shattered. 2015, 2016, and 2017 were all exceptionally hot years. Now, no one hot year by itself tells the story, but the 10 hottest years on record have all occurred since 1998. 2016 was the hottest year on record from start to finish. So sometimes we'll have a year where winter might be exceptionally warm, sometimes summer. 2016, hot from beginning to end. And the pattern is that the world keeps getting hotter. This should not be a surprise to anyone at this point, because it comes out of basic physics. We know from the basic physics of radiative transfer that when you put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it traps heat and the planet has to heat up. There just isn't really any way around that. And we know from tremendous amounts of different information, carbon dioxide is continuing to rise, has risen dramatically since the Industrial Revolution, and it's this dramatic rise in the last few years which is driving this dramatic increase in heat across the globe. Now, that said, though, one of the things that's important for us to understand and to be able to explain to our fellow citizen is that climate change is not equally distributed. We often talk about 2 degrees as a kind of threshold or upper limit for what's often referred to as dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. But the fact is actually that many parts of the globe have already passed that threshold. Scientists as far back as the 1970s identified the phenomenon known as polar amplification. How many people here know what that is? Some, but not most of you. Okay, so polar amplification is the phenomenon where global warming begins to accelerate more rapidly in the polar regions. And that happens because of what's known as the ice albedo effect. So you live here in Colorado, a lot of you ski, you know that snow and ice are very effective in reflecting sunlight back to space. So the polar regions, because they're covered in snow and ice, tend to stay cold. But global warming causes snow and ice to begin to melt. And when that snow and ice melts in the polar regions, it's replaced by the ocean, by water. And water is dark. Polar water tends to be dark bluish black. And that absorbs heat much more effectively. So as the pole begins to warm, you get more water exposed. That absorbs the heat more effectively. That causes more warming, which melts more snow and ice. And now you have a feedback loop. And that feedback loop causes the warming to be amplified or to happen more rapidly in polar regions than elsewhere in the globe. That was predicted by scientists in the 1970s, and already by 2005, large sections of the polar regions of the planet had already reached 2 degrees C. So we are already way past that 2-degree threshold in the polar regions. In fact, as I already said, most of the North Polar region has actually already experienced 4 degrees of warming. So if anyone tells you, oh, we have time to figure this out, we don't really know, just point them to this. Now, it's also true that climate change is distributed unequally in time as well as in space. And one of the things we've seen here in the United States that's particularly alarming, particularly if you care about snow and ice, is that winter warming is more than summer warming. So here in the United States, we've already seen, unfortunately this is Fahrenheit, it's a little infuriating that scientists go back and forth between Fahrenheit and centigrade, but we're smart, we can cope with that, right? So we've already seen nearly 3 degrees of winter warming, that's centigrade, since 1970, so that's 1.5 degrees centigrade. So we're already pushing up towards that 2-degree threshold in the winter warming here in the United States. Why does that matter? Well, if you care about winter, if you care about snow and ice, if you care about skiing or snowboarding, 191,000 jobs in the United States, $11.4 billion in revenue are tied up in winter sports. If we lose winter sports, we lose a big part of the economy of the Western United States. Since I'm in Colorado, I always try to say something specific for the place I'm in. So I'm on the board of Protect Our Winters. How many of you have heard of Protect Our Winters? Excellent. Okay. If you're not already a member, tomorrow please join. Only costs $5. We have a very low barrier to entry. If you care about winter, if you ice climb, if you ski, if you snowboard, if you just like snow, you should be one of us. One of the things we do is a report that we recently updated on the economic value of snow and ice in the United States. And here in Colorado, it's a complicated analysis, but it's based on comparing good snow years to bad snow years. So if you look at the average of, say, the average of bad snow years cost the state of Colorado about $90 million. So that's real money. So anyone who tells you that climate change isn't an economic problem or that we can't afford to fix climate change, actually we can't afford not to fix it. And of course this is just one example. There are many, many others. Let's talk a little bit about sea level rise. One of the things we know, climate change skeptics and deniers sometimes try to claim that scientists and environmentalists exaggerate the threat just to get attention or to get money for their research. Actually, our research shows that scientists have underestimated the threat of climate change. And the place in which that's clearest is with respect to sea level rise. Several studies that have come out in the last few years have shown that sea level is rising faster than scientists predicted. If we go back to the 4th assessment of the IPCC predicted a few years ago that sea level rise might reach 1 meter by 2100. Already by 2009, scientists had shown that that estimate was too low, that a more realistic estimate was between 1 and 1.6 meters. And last year, NOAA issued a new report that says, actually, the right number is as high as 2.5 meters. So that's more than 6 feet of sea level rise by the end of this century. So this is going to be in the lifetime of the students who are here today. Now, again, we've often seen climate skeptics and deniers like to say, oh, well, there's natural variability. Well, look at what the natural variability of sea level looks like going back to the time of Jesus Christ. We have ups and downs in sea level, that is true. There have been some centuries where sea level rose, some centuries where it fell, but look at the 20th century. This is nothing like we have ever seen in human history. Now, why does this matter? Well, here's a chart from the real estate website Zillow. So this isn't Greenpeace, this isn't NRDC or EDF. These are the people who live, whose lives are made by buying and selling real estate. This is a map that shows what 2 meters of sea level rise would do to the state of Florida. And you can see that we lose almost the entire southern tip of Florida. Zillow estimates that 1.9 million American homes are within 2 meters of current sea level rise, with a combined value of $880 billion, nearly $1 trillion in real estate within 2 meters of sea level rise. And of course, it's not just Florida. Almost 300 US cities would lose at least half their homes. 36 US cities would be completely lost. One of these cities that would be very gravely affected is San Diego, where my husband and I lived for many years. Huge amounts of expensive infrastructure, including hotels, airports, roads, bridges, Navy bases, Air Force installations, are within 1 meter of sea level. In fact, most of the US Navy installations in San Diego would be underwater. So this is a national security concern as well as an economic one. New York City, over $1 trillion in some of the most valuable real estate in the world. Maybe not the real estate people here love the most, but that's okay. The point is, we're all affected by this in different ways. Now, we're in Colorado, so I get it that sea level rise might not be the biggest concern when you live in the Rocky Mountains or the middle of America, but bark beetles should be. How many of you know about bark beetles? Okay, this is a great audience, so I don't need to belabor this point, but you all know that huge amounts of western forests are now being damaged by bark beetle. In South Dakota, the US Forest Service has concluded the beetle has invaded 430,000 acres since the epidemic started in 1996, about a quarter of the entire forested regions of the Black Hills. There are portions of Utah where more than 95% of the lodgepole pines have been killed. In fact, in Summit County back in 2010, City Councilman John Hannaran said, "We're in deep water." So there's a different way of thinking about deep water, right? But very, very severe killing. Now, one of the things that's very upsetting, though, about the bark beetle epidemic is that many people are still in denial about this, including some of the people who write the websites for the US Forest Service. So if you look at the website for the Black Hills National Forest, it says the following: "The forests of the Black Hills are changing, or they're not. William Illingworth, while on Custer's Black Hills expedition in 1874, photographed a more open forest caused by fire and insects. Modern forest management, including careful use of fire, can recreate some of those conditions and ecological processes and restore healthier, more resilient forests for the long term. It takes a collaborative, all-hands approach to do it. While much work remains to be done, we are making a difference." And Royal Clark, a US Forest Service spokeswoman in Utah, said, quote, "It's a cycle that all national forests grow through. It's a matter of getting used to a different face of the forest." Well, our theme tonight and tomorrow is transitions, and as we all know, we are going to be getting used to a different face of the forest. Climate change is causing very severe changes, many of which are irreversible. But it's not true that this is just any old change like other changes we've seen before. We know what's driving this change, and it's because climate change is making winters warmer in ways that are causing the bark beetle larvae to survive through the winter in a way that they didn't before. So this is a specific form of damage, and we have scientific evidence that proves that it is related to climate change. Like sea level rise, this is not natural variability. Another issue that many of you have heard of is the loss of Arctic sea ice. And again, this is another example where scientists have not exaggerated the threat, but in fact they have underestimated it. So let's turn now to the politics. So again, I don't need to belabor the point that we're living in a very politically challenging time, but I thought I would start by just showing you two clips from our film, Merchants of Doubt, that summarize what a significant part of this political challenge looks like. Now, I know a lot of you here have had a chance to see the film, but for those of you who haven't, this will sort of give you a short kind of Reader's Digest condensed version of it. So this clip shows us the basic storyline and explains who are these people? Who are the Merchants of Doubt? Okay, that didn't work. Tyler, do you think you can? Yeah, if you could just hit the arrow there. Thank you. Can you hear that? Can you make it a little louder?
It was a war on oil. They had an off-oil agenda. Climate change was part of that. I think that it's unfortunate that the science is so distorted in this state, and without
the science is complicated. There are lots of different factors, so you really have to understand the whole picture.
There is a natural variability that has nothing to do with me.
Climate is changing naturally.
It has to do with sunspots. It has to do with the wobble of the earth.
And so it's not too difficult to persuade some of the public that we really don't know for sure. So maybe let's wait a while. We need to have more proof.
We need more data. The science isn't there to make that determination.
there is no need for us to rush to this kind of judgment.
Others put out ads saying more pollution is going to be good for us.
A doubling of the CO2 content of the atmosphere will produce a tremendous greening of planet Earth.
CO2 is a benefit to plant life. It's increasing the bounty and the productivity of the planet, our ability to feed populations in this world.
What you're seeing here from the coal industry is perfectly analogous to what the tobacco industry used to do. They refuse to change, refuse to shift, and they're trying to convince us that it's actually good for us. The way they used to say, luckies make you healthy.
So, you know, I'm an academic, and of course, as an academic, we revel in the details. We write long books with lots of footnotes, but of course, media always want you to reduce your book to a soundbite or a single sentence. So I came up with the following. When someone tells you that pollution is good for you, you probably should be suspicious. Okay, so one of the questions that we wanted to answer in our book was, why did this work? So you saw in that first clip that most of those people are executives of the fossil fuel industry. So it's not really surprising that fossil fuel executives would try to tell you that fossil fuels are good for us and climate change is who knows what. We don't really know. It's the wobble of the earth. It's natural variability. But why? How do they make this work? How do they make this argument persuasive and convincing to the American people? So this next clip gives you a little clue about how this works.
They present themselves as scientific, and they even use graphics to make them look like the actual scientific reports that they're trying to discredit.
This is a report produced by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And here is the mirror of that, produced by the Cato Institute. They've adopted the exact same page layout design. If you were a congressman, how would you tell the difference between this and this one? And that's the point of this deception.
This is kind of an extended summary. It's called a synthesis report.
So,
the actual IPCC report is about so thick.
and how thick is your NIPCC report?
Same. It's same.
You're as thick as they are?
We strictly use the same thickness.
Out of the mouths of babes. So, okay. So the key strategy, confuse people, create doubt, and by creating doubt, delay action. So why is this so bad? Why does it matter? Well, as many of you know, we now are in a moment where the merchants of doubt have actually taken over the federal government. Myron E. Bell, who is not in those scenes you just saw, but is in some of the other scenes in the film, is a longtime economist at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. He's been denying climate change since the early 1990s. He headed the EPA transition team. Another person on the EPA transition team was a man by the name of Steve Malloy, who calls himself, without irony, the junk man, and worked for many years for the Philip Morris tobacco industry. Scott Pruitt, I don't think I need to say too much about him. You all know. But what about Rex Tillerson? You know, when Rex Tillerson was nominated to be Secretary of State, a lot of people I knew thought that was a good thing. They said, oh, but Tillerson says he accepts climate science, that he accepts that climate change is real. So I want to show you one more clip from the film about Rex Tillerson and about what he was working on at ExxonMobil before he joined the Trump administration.
Top US oil company ExxonMobil and Russia's Rosneft have signed a deal to develop oil and gas reserves in the Russian Arctic.
One of the reasons this deal is now possible is because
human-induced global warming that has rolled the ice back. It's warmer in the Arctic than it's been in at least 40,000 years. And yet there's ExxonMobil looking at that, thinking they can drill more. The very thing they paid groups to tell us wouldn't happen has now benefited them.
Now, you may know also that when Rex Tillerson became Secretary of State, one of the things he began to work on was to try to roll back the Russian sanctions. And why was that? Because the Russian sanctions were the one thing standing between ExxonMobil and drilling those reserves. And why does that matter? Because development and combustion of those reserves will push global atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations far above the level of dangerous climate disruption. There are numerous scientific studies that have demonstrated it. These are the largest remaining untapped oil and gas reserves in the world. And one recent scientific paper in Nature put it this way: development of resources in the Arctic is incommensurate with efforts to limit average global warming to 2 degrees C. So Rex Tillerson can say that he accepts the science, that he knows climate change is real. But, you know, my mama always told me actions speak louder than words. Watch what people do, not what they say. And as long as ExxonMobil is trying to drill those Russian Arctic reserves, they are not, in fact, accepting the science. Okay, so why does all this happen? What are we looking at politically? So this is a complicated issue, and it's a delicate one, because obviously we all want to work in a bipartisan manner if we can. We want to create alliances with other people who understand that this is a real problem. But we also have this problem of this deep political polarization on this issue. And this polarization did not begin with Donald Trump. In fact, my argument is that if we want to understand and get past it, we actually have to understand where it came from. And if we look at the voting records of Democrats and Republicans in Congress on environmental issues, we discover something very interesting and important, which is that up until 1990, the voting records of Democrats and Republicans weren't that different. If we go back even further to the 1960s, there was widespread bipartisan support for major pieces of environmental legislation, like the Wilderness Act, the National Environmental Protection Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and of course, as many of you know, Clean Water, Clean Air, and NEPA were all signed into law by Richard Nixon, a Republican president. And throughout the 80s and 90s, Democrats leaned a little bit more in the direction of environmental protection, but it wasn't that different from Republicans, and there were certainly individual Republicans who were much better on environmental issues than many individual Democrats. But around 1990, it changed, and it changed really dramatically, where suddenly Democrats really took on environmentalism as an issue, so getting scores of like 95% from the League of Conservation Voting, and Republicans went the other way, going down to scores below 10% by that same organization. And this trend has continued even since 2010. And this is where politics comes in, where we can't really understand the current situation if we don't take on board the political questions. And so one of the questions I wanted to understand was, why did Republicans stop supporting environmental protection? As I've already said, if you go back to the 60s or even the 30s or the 20s, actually Republicans were better on environmental issues than Democrats were. But since the end of the Cold War, there's a reason that 1990 year is not coincidental. There's been an increasing commitment of American conservatives to the principles of laissez-faire capitalism, the idea of letting markets flourish, letting markets, quote, do their magic, and decreasing government involvement in the economy and in our lives. Now, sometimes that's a good idea. Not all government interventions are good, but we know that sometimes markets fail. Sometimes we have a legal product that hurts or kills people. And sometimes economic activity creates serious problems, like climate change, that markets don't seem to know how to fix. Economists have a name for this situation. They call it market failure. It's not really a controversial idea. You can find it in any economic textbook. And what economists will tell you is that they require some kind of response that comes from outside the marketplace. And typically, that someplace is the government. Now, until recently, if you asked an economist what was the greatest market failure ever, they would tell you it was the American Great Depression, or I should say the global Great Depression. But if you ask them now, they'll tell you that the answer is climate change. In the single most important report written about the economics of climate change, the Stern Report for the UK government, Lord Nicholas Stern wrote that anthropogenic climate change is the greatest and widest ranging market failure ever seen. The Stern Report calculated the external cost of carbon, that is to say all the costs associated with climate change, and concluded that it was in the trillions of dollars. And Lord Stern is therefore now a major advocate for carbon pricing. And this, I want to argue, helps to explain why denial is so prevalent among Americans, among people in the private sector, so in the business community, and among conservatives who are opposed to what they would call big government. Because if you believe in the magic of the marketplace, that is to say, that the market is letting the market solve a problem is a better strategy than having the government address it, then you're going to be reluctant to admit it when that magic fails. And now we add to this one more key piece, the claim that if the government intervenes, we'll lose our personal freedom and liberty. And this is a very common trope that you find in climate change denial literature and advertisements. So I just want to show you a really short clip. This is the introduction to a Tea Party rally in 2008. So the whole message of the Tea Party was that they were defending freedom and that liberals, Democrats, and environmentalists were trying to take it away. So what we find in all of this, what we argued in our book and in the film, is that climate change denial is not about the scientific facts. It's what sociologists and psychologists call implicatory denial. You reject facts when you don't like their implications. And we all do this in many different ways. This isn't something that only conservatives do. For example, think about all the smokers who rejected the evidence that smoking was addictive, because if you smoke and you find out smoking is addictive, then you're kind of admitting that you're an addict. And let's face it, nobody really wants to be an addict. So implicatory denial is a very, very common thing. But a lot of times it just involves us as individuals making choices, like not admitting that our job isn't working out, or not admitting that our relationship isn't working out. But in this case, the implication is really global. And there are many implications, but one of the key ones is that the free market isn't magic, that we need the government to intervene. Now, the fossil fuel industry obviously plays a role in this story because climate change denial is mostly funded and promoted by the fossil fuel industry. And obviously, they don't want to give up a profitable product. That's not exactly a mystery. But the more subtle part of the story, the part that is a little harder to understand, is why this argument succeeds with the American people. And so in our book and our film, we argue that it succeeds because it plays on our commitment and belief in free markets, our resistance to big government, our historic belief that the government that governs best governs least, our dislike of taxes, and our love of freedom, which is a legitimate, genuine, and actually wonderful thing. In fact, these are all reasonable things. Nobody really wants more government if we don't need it. Nobody wants more taxes if we don't need it. And nobody wants to give up freedom if we don't have to. So here's the crucial point, and I want to argue the grounds for hope in this otherwise somewhat depressing talk. Acting on climate change doesn't mean we have to have bigger government or higher taxes. ExxonMobil and the climate deniers want us to think that it does, but I want to argue that they're wrong. And so this now will be the final part of the talk, so hopefully the upbeat part that leaves you feeling happy, not depressed. So how do we know this? How do we know that we could actually solve this problem without bigger government? Well, let's look at the other issues where science was also challenged by the merchants of doubt. The exact same arguments that are made today about climate change were previously made about tobacco, about acid rain, about the ozone hole, and a whole host of other things. And in every one of these cases, we actually fixed these problems, and we didn't become communists. We didn't end up living in a Soviet totalitarian dictatorship. We didn't even really end up giving up much freedom. So think about acid rain. Acid rain was largely addressed by the Clean Air Act amendments of 1995, signed into law by President George H.W. Bush, and implementing an emissions trading system to control the pollution that causes acid rain. taxes did not rise. In fact, the price of electricity fell, and people in the American Midwest did not end up losing their freedom. We solved this problem with a sensible law or regulation, and the private sector responded to that regulation and found solutions that worked. Now, admittedly, there was some loss of freedom. Utilities lost the freedom to dump pollution into the atmosphere without being responsible for it. But I would argue that's a pretty faulty kind of freedom. What about the ozone hole? How did we fix that? Well, we banned the chemicals that caused it, a group of chemicals known as chlorinated fluorocarbons. And we did that through an international treaty, the Montreal Protocol to protect the ozone layer. So did taxes rise? Did our government get bigger? Did we lose our freedom? No, we still have refrigerators, we still have air conditioners. We didn't lose the freedom to buy and use those products. And why not? Well, because when the Montreal Protocol was signed into law, DuPont, who were the largest manufacturer of those chemicals, responded to that law and came up with substitutes, came up with alternatives that were just as effective and didn't even cost more. In fact, the substitutes turned out to be no more expensive than the products they replaced. I like to remind people that we all know that necessity is the mother of invention, and regulation is a very powerful form of necessity. If you tell the private sector that they need to change, they do. And it turns out often they keep on making good money and having good jobs. DuPont is still a very successful corporation. And what about tobacco? In our book, we showed that the folks who were promoting doubt about the reality of anthropogenic climate change had previously worked with the tobacco industry to promote doubt about the harms of smoking. In fact, one of the most famous lines out of our book that's been quoted in a number of court cases, a memo from the tobacco industry in 1969 where they said, "Doubt is our product, since it's the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public," proving that the notion of post-truth was not invented in 2017. The tobacco industry strategy was the same as the strategy that we are continuing to face on climate change today. Insist that the science is unsettled, so we've got Scott Pruitt saying we need a red team and a blue team to argue it out. Insist that it's up to people to decide for themselves whether or not they want to smoke, and that if we try to control smoking, people will lose their freedom. And argue that if we let the government decide whether or not we should smoke, then it's only a matter of time before the government controls other aspects of our lives. So what did we do in the face of this deadly product that was legal? Well, we did a lot of different things. We took legal action. Many ordinary citizens, as well as attorney generals of 36 of the 50 states, sued the industry for damages caused by its product. One of my favorite cases was a civil case brought by a group of flight attendants who brought attention to the danger of secondhand smoke and sued for the damages of lung cancer caused by smoke in aircraft. And this is a great case. It's the case of Norma Bruin et al. Versus Philip Morris. And one of the issues that always came up with respect to smoking and secondhand smoke was the argument that people chose to smoke. It was their own responsibility. So how can you sue the company when you chose to smoke? Well, Norma Bruin was a Mormon. And when juries found that out, she didn't smoke, she didn't drink, she'd never smoked in her life. Her friends, her families all testified to the fact that she had never smoked, but she had been subject to secondhand smoke in aircraft. And they won that case, and it was a turning point in the debate over secondhand smoke to point out that people were being killed by this product, people who had not chosen to smoke, people who had never smoked a cigarette in their life. And of course, the US Department of Justice ultimately prosecuted the tobacco industry for conspiracy to commit fraud against the American people. But there were other things too. Citizens organized to create local bans on smoking in public places. The federal government ended up banning smoking on airplanes. And many states, began to raise taxes on tobacco products to discourage young people from taking up the habit. And we have many studies that show that those taxes worked. Now, we can ask the question, was there a loss of freedom? Well, I think we'd have to say yes, in a way there was. Smokers can't smoke anywhere they want. Now, smokers mostly have to smoke in the privacy of their own homes. But on the other hand, there was also a huge gain in freedom. The freedom of the majority of Americans not to be harmed by secondhand smoke, not to be forced to inhale the smoke of other people. And was there a net increase in taxation? Well, actually, no. Smokers have to pay more for the right to smoke, but the majority of us actually pay less because we no longer pay the huge costs of smoking-related damage. And the settlements that were made with the state were used to defray the Medicare and Medicaid costs of smoking-related disease. So given this history, why should we believe anything that climate deniers say? Well, I think the obvious answer is we shouldn't. Given their history, they really shouldn't be viewed as having any credibility at all. But there's another even better argument for why we should reject climate change denial and how we can move forward on this issue, particularly with our fellow citizens or neighbors or friends or family members who may accept that climate change are real but are still skeptical of the idea of a carbon tax or of some kind of large-scale government solution. The answer is that the solution to climate change already exists, and it doesn't require bigger government, higher net taxes, or a loss of freedom. In fact, if it's done right, it will grow the economy, not the government, and actually increase our options and therefore our freedom. And that's the clean energy revolution. So you wouldn't know it watching Fox News or CNN or even reading the New York Times, and you certainly wouldn't know it listening to oil and gas industry executives insisting that we can't live without fossil fuels. But both in this country and around the world, there is an energy revolution taking place. As many of you know, the cost of solar photovoltaic electricity has fallen dramatically in recent years. In many places in the world, solar energy is now the newest, cheapest new form of energy in 60 countries, according to Bloomberg News. It is cheaper to install solar photovoltaics than to build a new coal, oil, or gas-fired power plant. Not surprisingly, then, the capacity is soaring. Wind capacity is also rising around the world, growing exponentially, and at much greater rates than were predicted even a few years ago. Renewables are now half of all new installed electrical capacity around the globe. We are moving away from the fuels of the 19th and 20th century into the fuels of the 21st. Or as I like to say, coal is so 19th century. In 2017, China, Donald Trump loves to blame China for all kinds of things, China announced cancellations of 104 new coal plants. China is moving away from coal and towards renewables. So what's driving this? Is it the magic of the marketplace? Maybe it's all good and we actually don't have to worry. The private sector is going to take care of this problem for us. Well, the answer is not exactly. There have been a number of studies now trying to understand what is driving this big decrease in the price of renewables, because it's really important to understand maybe the private sector really will just solve this problem. But the answer is policies that stimulate the market. In other words, the private sector is responding, just as it responded to the Montreal Protocol, just as it responded to the Clean Air Act amendments, but it's responding to policy. And the most important policies are the German feed-in tariff, which made utilities in Germany had to accept renewable energy generated by municipalities or individuals and then pay for that at the same rate that they would pay for electricity from a coal-fired power plant. And that stimulated the industry then to start producing more solar panels, knowing that there would be a market for that product. And now you have major manufacturers in Germany like Siemens producing large amounts of solar panels, and therefore the costs begin to come down. And also carbon pricing, not so much in Germany, but in other countries. Now, most economists think that going forward, the single most important thing we could do to stimulate the renewable economy is to put a price on carbon, either a carbon tax or an emissions trading system, to make the price of using fossil fuels reflect the true cost. And this could be done on the federal, the state, or even the local level. In fact, around the world, 46 countries now either have carbon pricing or are seriously considering this. And this, interestingly enough, includes China, France, Ireland, Mexico, the European Union, and I just recently discovered Kazakhstan. So around the globe, people are leading on this issue. We also have emissions trading systems or carbon pricing or some system to encourage renewable energies in many American states, including Connecticut, Delaware, Maine, Massachusetts, etc. Now, at the moment, in most of these places, the carbon prices aren't high enough, but it's a start. We're moving in the right direction. Now, carbon pricing is a kind of taxation, or can be viewed as a kind of taxation, but the important point is it doesn't mean that our net tax burden has to grow. We can reduce taxes elsewhere, for example, by reducing payroll or corporate taxes. And this is what has, in fact, been done successfully in a number of places, including British Columbia and Kazakhstan. So the fact is we have the technology we need, but to get it at the scale we need the right incentives. We need to send the right signals to the marketplace, and we have to do that through the right policies. So, not convinced? Well, I want to show you one more example that I think really makes the case. So in the last few years, I've had the privilege of being invited to the World Economic Forum in Davos, where we've got to rub elbows with a lot of pretty famous, fancy people. Well, actually, we mostly just see them in a distance, surrounded by bodyguards. But I've been able to participate in something called the Global Situation Space. This is a collaborative project with colleagues at Carnegie Mellon University who have taken global environmental and economic data from the US Geological Survey, from Bloomberg News, from S&P, Standard & Poor, a whole variety of different sources, digitize all this data and then turn it into computer visualizations. So we can show people, not just tell, but show things ranging from environmental damage to the uptake of solar power. So we can illustrate both the problem space and also the solution space. So this is me at the Global Situation Space talking about the uptake of solar energy in the United States and showing the power of policy. So this is a satellite image taken from the Google Earth engine showing the distribution of solar energy, photovoltaic electricity in the United States starting in 1984. Places that have installed solar capacity are shown as bright lights. And you can see on this map that there really isn't any. Well, there's this weird little tiny dot here in Orlando. So I don't know, Disney, I guess, was already doing something interesting, probably at Epcot, since that was supposed to be the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. So I guess it actually was. In 1984, not one state in the United States had any kind of policies to stimulate solar PV adoption. But now, fast forward to 2015. Look at that. Nearly all of California is lit up, parts of Arizona, a little bit of Nevada, and pretty much the entire northeast Atlantic seaboard of the United States. So what made this happen? These states are all part of the same country, the United States. There's a bit down here in Florida, too, especially along the coast. So we're all Americans, but the states that are lit up, and these are not necessarily the sunniest states, right? I mean, if we were expecting this to be mostly where the sun shines brightest, we should see mostly the Four Corners state and maybe some parts of Texas, but that's not what you see. But these are the states that all adopted strong policies to support renewable energy, such as AB 32 in California or the RGGI system in Massachusetts. Now, if you look really closely, there's something actually even more interesting. And this is the close-up of the Northeast in 2015. And notice this weird little hole right here, this rectangle. Anybody know what that is? Rhode Island, yeah. Okay, I like Rhode Island. Some of my best friends are from Rhode Island. But look at that. I mean, this is amazing. The people in Rhode Island have average annual incomes not that different from southern Massachusetts or eastern Connecticut. Education levels are not that different. And the weather is exactly the same. So what's the difference between Rhode Island and Massachusetts? Policy. So this is the proof positive of the difference in impact of policy. The technology is the same, the people are the same, we speak more or less the same language, although they do call milkshake cabinets, but you know, you get the point, right? Policy stimulates technology. Now, and until last year, Rhode Island had no or very weak renewable energy standards. That's going to change. They recently passed a standard encouraging wind, so we're going to see big changes in Rhode Island with respect to wind power, but it hasn't happened yet. Now, all this renewable energy doesn't just light up homes, it also creates jobs. In the United States today, there are about 65,000 jobs in coal. I know a lot of them are here in Colorado, but about 195,000 jobs in oil and gas. How many jobs are there in clean energy? Well, there's a lot of disagreement about the statistics because it depends on how you define green energy, but something between 800,000 and 3.5 million jobs. So even at the low end, that's 2 to 3 times the amount of jobs in fossil fuels. So when people start talking about jobs, there are more jobs, way more jobs in the renewable energy industry than there are in fossil fuels. These jobs are in every state. In fact, there are more in red states than in blue ones, partly because of the big growth of wind in Texas. And it's one of the fastest growing sectors of the US economy. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 13% growth in 2015. That's huge. Hardly any other sector of the economy is growing like that. Solar now exceeds all jobs in oil, gas, and coal combined. For comparison, the auto industry employs about 7.25 million. So we're not competing quite with the oil industry yet, but actually the renewable energy industry is now moving in the direction of being a really significant source of employment in the United States. So in an economy where growth overall has been sluggish, renewable energy growth is strong, and it is now outpacing many other sectors. So this is a colossally good news story that I think we haven't done nearly enough to tell. So the take home is there's real good news here. Real good news based on facts, based on evidence. The technology we need to fix this problem largely exists, and it creates good jobs, jobs that can't be easily outsourced. But there is one still remaining serious problem. We're just not doing it fast enough. As all of you who follow the climate change problem know, this problem has got to be solved in the next 20 years, or else we really are looking at massive dislocations. So to accelerate this great energy transition, and that's what we're here to talk about tonight, transitions, we need the right policies. Policies that support the renewable industry and discourage fossil fuel production and consumption. In other words, the solution is technology plus policy. We know from history that technology alone doesn't solve the problem, and part of this is because for now fossil fuels still are cheaper in most places, and sometimes a lot cheaper. So I just want to quickly talk about why that is. The obvious elephant in the room is fossil fuel subsidies. Fossil fuels are massively subsidized. In fact, they're cheap. In most places where they're cheap, it's because of subsidies. Both direct subsidies, like the oil depletion allowance and tax credits, and also indirect subsidies, like all the money we pay the US military to protect shipping lanes in the Persian Gulf. The US, the World Bank, together with OPEC, OECD, and IEA, again, not Greenpeace and not EDF, did a study in 2008 that concluded that direct subsidies to fossil fuels, so just direct ones, not including indirect subsidies like the military, $700 billion every single year. Compare that to agricultural subsidies, $400 billion. The fishing industry, $30 billion. Low carbon energy, $26 billion. So it's a pittance compared to what we do. So it's interesting because lots of Americans have the impression that renewable energies are heavily subsidized. It's actually not true. Fossil fuels are the most subsidized industry in the world. If we look just at the United States alone, fossil fuel subsidies exceed renewables by a factor of 7. Here's another way to think about it. According to the World Bank, fossil fuel subsidies are about 1% of total global GDP. The estimated cost of mitigating climate change is about 2 to 3% of GDP. So we could solve about half to a third of this problem if we just eliminated fossil fuel subsidies and shifted that investment to renewables. The other reason why fossil fuels are heavily subsidized is the issue of external costs. That's the difference between the price we pay in the marketplace and the cost we pay in the various forms of damage of the product. So for example, if we think about tobacco, we might pay $5 a pack for tobacco, that's the market price, but we also pay with our health if we contract emphysema or heart disease or die from lung cancer. And even if we don't smoke, we pay when we cover the health insurance costs of other folks who do. This is what economists call external costs. The International Monetary Fund estimates the external cost of carbon to be $1.3 trillion every year. So if we just eliminated subsidies and eliminated these external costs, this would be a giant boon to the global economy. So my take-home message is to solve the climate energy problem, we need technology and policy. We need to eliminate subsidies to fossil fuels and let renewables compete on a level playing field. We need to internalize the external costs and pay the true cost of carbon, either through a carbon tax or some other pricing system. And we have to invest in the infrastructure to make renewables work. Now, it would be another talk to talk about how the existing electricity was largely built by the federal government, but we need the government now to intervene to rebuild that structure to support renewables through policies such as demand response pricing or removing the caps on renewables that some of us talked about earlier today, by putting research into energy storage and other things like that, which will make it possible for renewables to satisfy more of the demand. So we don't need bigger government, but we do need different policies. Policies that help us create the future we want for ourselves and for all the other humans and creatures which we share the gifts of creation. What I always like to emphasize when I speak in public is that fighting climate change isn't about protecting the planet, it's about protecting us and the things we love. In my case, the beauty of the mountains, the beauty of winter, the beauty of snow and ice. And I want to leave with one final point and one last clip from the film. It's not fixing climate change that will lead to bigger government and loss of freedom, it's actually denying it. So if we could have the final clip.
As sea level rises and hurricanes become more intense, people get killed, their houses and communities get destroyed. Or think about heat waves and droughts that ruin agricultural communities. All of these are problems that it will require government intervention to address. The great irony of the story, to me, is that people who don't like big government are going to get more of it. And we're going to see more money being spent on dealing with the aftermath of these disasters. There will be billions of dollars in real estate losses, but more than that, people will die. That's why it matters. That's why this is meaningful for us and not just for polar bears or people in Bangladesh. That's why so many people in the scientific community now are really starting to talk in very worried tones, because there's, I think, a growing sense in the scientific community that we're running out of time to prevent a train wreck.
And so my final thought to you is to ask you all to do what we all can do to prevent that wreck. Thank you very much.